Hello. It's great to see you. I know. I can't see you, but I feel like I see you. Anyway, it's a beautiful day down the shore. I'm looking out at the ocean as I always do, and I always appreciate God and the nature he has given us. What a beautiful gift. Okay, so if you look at the first page of your papers, and if you don't get papers, remember you can write to me at Barbara Arnold, all one word, lowercase, 47 at gmail.com. And if you do that and ask me to put you on my list of contacts, I will do so and you will get the papers. Okay, so we are finally going to get to Melchizedek. We've been going through Hebrews, and Hebrews has been preparing us from the very first chapter for this Melchizedek section. It is the highlight, the high watermark of Hebrews, this several chapters on Melchizedek. We've been taking note that Jesus has been called the high priest in every single chapter. And then in chapter 5, all of a sudden, we learned that he's a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And again in chapter 6, a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And finally, chapter 7, we get there. So last week we looked at, we looked at that in Hebrews, and now this week we're going to look at Melchizedek, where he first appears, and that is in chapter 14. Now this is another Bible study that will tax your brain. In fact, I had two men saying to me as they left Thursday that their brain hurt. And that's because, we come from a background where we haven't been taught to think about God's Word a lot of times. And we've been taught to read it devotionally, which is a part of how we read things, and that's right. But sometimes that borders on only reading those things that affect us emotionally, and taking that to heart rather than to every single part of what we're reading. We need to use our brain, and then that will affect our heart. We need to know what the Bible says first, and only at the end of a Bible study do we read it as what does the Bible say to me. So you want to know what God means by the scripture, and then you can get what the Bible means to you. So we're studying what God says. Okay, so in order to do this Melchizedek section, we really have to fit it into the context of Genesis. And so let's go to Genesis 12 when Abraham is chosen, because it's about Abraham too, as well as Melchizedek in chapter 14. Abram is told by God to leave Ur of the Chaldees. He goes over the Fertile Crescent and stops at Haran. His family wants to stay there, and so he does stay there for a while, and God tells him again, you need to leave your family and come down into the land that I have promised you. And so he and Lot leave the family and go down. This tells us that Lot must have believed just as Abram did, and Lot wanted to stick to Abram. When they get down there, though, to the promised land, that's Canaan, or later Israel, when they get down there, Not long afterwards, a famine arrives. And what does Abram do? Well, he does the wrong thing. He leaves the promised land rather than trust God. And he goes down to Egypt, where he gets into very hot water. The Pharaoh has taken his wife, Sarai, and it is only by the intervening work of God, Yahweh, that she gets freed. And the Pharaoh is so upset that he gives Abram much wealth, and cattle and sheep. And so Abram leaves and comes back to the promised land. And that's where we meet him in chapter 13, where we have this wonderful chapter that I would like you to read. And I'm going to read with you, and I want you to circle land and valley. Two important words in this story, land and valley. So we're going to read it. And another thing I want you to look for is a technique he uses. So let's see if you can get that technique. And it says in chapter 13, now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold, and he journeyed on from the Negev, and that's the desert region of southern Canaan, as far as Bethel, kind of like the middle of Canaan, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning. So what do we mean? Well, when he first came, he had a tent at Bethel, and then he left to go down to Egypt. So we're being told he goes to the place where he had been at the beginning and sets up his tent. And this place is between Bethel and Ai, it says, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. So 2 times we're being reminded that Abram goes back to the place where he first began. It says, again, let's read that, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning. And then in verse 4, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. So it's emphasizing that this is where he was supposed to be, and he finally returns to it. And then it goes on, and there Abram called upon the name of Yahweh. We have a setting here, and now we're going to get into a story that is going to be kind of complex, in that we have the union that was there between Abram and Lot is going to be severed. They're going to be separated. Now, you got to understand, that Abram is old. He is very, very rich, and he has no children yet, although God has given him promises that he would be a great nation. But in his mind, he has no children. So who's going to be his heir? Well, Lot. So maybe it's going to be through Lot that he makes a great nation. Lot is his brother's son. And so this separation is going to kind of mess up Abram's plan B, that if he doesn't have a son, at least he has Lot. So let's see what happens here. In verse 5, it says this, and Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. So he's pretty rich himself. So that the land, now remember what we said, we're going to circle land and valley, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. Now you got to understand, they have sheep, and sheep eat very close to the root of grass. And so they have to move from one place to another. Sheep herders move and move as soon as the sheep, and it takes time for the grass to grow again, long enough for the sheep. So they have to go from place to place to place. And it seemed as though with all the cities there and other peoples there was not enough room for both of them, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, now remember, this is the land of promise. This is the promised land. So keep that in mind as you're circling that word land. Then Abram said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. In other words, brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, north, then I will go to the right, south. Or if you take the right hand, south, then I will go to the left, north. Now, when you read this in your scriptures, the normal translation would be, if you take the left, I'll take the right. If you take the right, I'll take the left. But the word for left is also the word north. How could that be when we think of the left as being west and the right hand as being east, don't we? That's because we think of the north as the place where we face, right? But that's not so with the people of antiquity. They would have faced where the sun rises. That means the east was their place of figuring out where they were, and that would always be where the sun rises in the east. So therefore, if you're faced east, right, your left hand would be what direction? North. Your right hand would be what direction? South. So keep that in mind, because he's saying to him, look, all this land given to me by God, I'm going to allow you to choose. Now, he's being very magnanimous, isn't he? If you want the north, you got it, I'll go south. If you want the south, you've got it, I'll take the north. He's being, he's thinking that Lot perhaps will be his heir. And so he wants to give Lot the area that he's going to inherit. So let's see what happens in verse 10. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of Yahweh, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. Zoar was the place where Lot is going to end up after he flees Sodom. So we're having that mentioned now. This was before Yahweh destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Ooh. We're being told plenty ahead of time before Sodom and Gomorrah is destroyed. They're not going to be destroyed until chapter 19. This is chapter 13, so keep that in mind. This is before Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot is going to choose the land where he's going to settle. And what does he do? He lifts up his eyes and saw the Jordan Valley. Okay? And so it's got to be near Sodom and Gomorrah because that's what's being mentioned here. So Lot chose for himself the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Wait a second. What was offered to him? The north or the south? And he journeys east rather than to the north or the south, to outside the promised land. It's east of the promised land. Now, I don't know if you remember this from your studies or from our Bible study, but east is not a good place to go. Remember when Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden, they have to go east out of the doorway on the east side of the garden. When Cain flees, he goes east of Eden. So again, east is not a good place. 2 times it tells us that the people of Babel had journeyed east. How about that? And now Lot is choosing to go not north, not south, the author of Abraham, but to go east, outside the land he's going to go. In fact, if you remember, Esau and his descendants, Ishmael and his descendants, the other children of Abraham that he had through his second wife, Keturah, all of them go east. They all become enemies of the children of Israel in the land of Israel. So east is not a good place to go. Thus they separated from each other. Verse 12, Abram settled in the land. Remember, that's what's promised to him, the land. He stays in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled where? Among the cities of the valley, and moved his tent as far as Sodom, outside the land that was promised. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against Yahweh. The second time we're told about Sodom, isn't it? Yes, we're being prepared for what is going to happen in chapter 19. And we're being told Lot is there. Now that's important because, well, the next story will show us. Yahweh said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, that's the second time we get that word separated, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, westward. You look all over, he says, for all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length, the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So we see that Abram stays in the land that God had promised him, whereas Lot goes to the valley to the east. See, there's a contrast there, isn't there? Now watch the last verse. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. And there he built an altar to Yahweh. Where did you learn already that Abram journeyed, that he moved his tent, and that he built an altar to Yahweh? Right, at the very beginning of our story. So what do we have around our story? We have bookends. And what do we learn about Abram from the bookends? That he's a serious worshiper of Yahweh. And it's because of this that he has the wisdom to stay in the land. But these bookends, which show us Abram's heart, a worshiping heart, that he is being contrasted with Lot. Now let's look at the contrast. Lot chooses the valley, doesn't he? Whereas Abram chooses to stay in the land. They both settle someplace, but they settle in two different regions. Now, I want you to look at verse 10 because this is an extremely important verse. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw. Is that reminding you of anything? I hope so. Somebody else had eyes to see. And he saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of Yahweh. What's the garden of Yahweh? Eden. So, he sees this land and he said, wow, that looks like the garden of God. Now, Yahweh had cast out the people from the garden, and he sees something that looks so much like it. He wants it, doesn't he? But in order to get there, how does he travel? He has to travel east, and that's why in verse 11, so Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Well, who went east? Adam and Eve. From where? The garden of Yahweh. Because they saw something they thought was good, but it wasn't. It wasn't God's good. And so Lot is another Adam and Eve, isn't he? It's like the design patterns, isn't it, that we saw before? This is a design pattern. We are seeing Lot through the glasses of Adam and Eve. So we're seeing that the author is connecting what Lot is doing with what Adam and Eve did. And so this is not good. And so Abram now has no heir that's part of his family because Lot separates from him, and it's never good to separate from Abram. Okay, now, what's important about this chapter is it prepares us for what happens in chapter 14. There's going to be a battle of the kings, and that doesn't seem like it should have anything to do with Abram, because Abram is in the west of Canaan. But the battle of the kings is in the eastern side. And so Abram has nothing to do with it. But Abram has dragged into it, isn't he? How? Because Lot is going to be kidnapped. And Abram has to save Lot's life. And so that is why we're given the story in chapter 14. Not that the author cared about this battle, except what it has to do with Abram and Lot. So do you see why I took you into chapter 13? It prepares the way for chapter 14. And let's see. Anything else? Let's go. Now the next page has Genesis 14, 1-9. But because it is really hard to read, because there's so many kings named, and so many cities are named, it gets very complicated. But if you see it the way the Jewish people would have seen it, it would have been less complicated. And so that's what I put on the next page. Because as complex as this is, it's in the form of a chiasm, which makes it a lot easier to think about and read. So that's what we're going to do. Now I'm going to just read right through. You can take note of the ABCs on the left. Take note of the fact that things are in reverse order. But listen to the story because it's very important. Now I'm going to read it for you because I know you're going to The names are very, very difficult in some circumstances. So we're going to take a look at it. Now it was in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar. That's Babylon. That's the old-fashioned name for Babylon. So Amraphel, king of Shinar. Arioch, king of Elasar. Chedorlaomer, king of Elam. I like to call him cheddar cheese because it sounds like Chedorlaomer, cheddar cheese, of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, prepared for battle against Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. Okay. And then all these joined together in the valley of Siddim, that is the Sea of Salt. That's the Dead Sea. For 12 years, these Canaanite kings, on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, where Lot is moving to, for 12 years, they had been subservient to cheddar cheese. I want you to circle his name right there because he's going to be named twice. Cheddar cheese, or Chedorlaomer. And in the 13th year, they had revolted. These kings on the eastern part of Canaan, where Lot is moving to, these kings were subservient to the kings of the east, the eastern side of the Fertile Crescent, who were with 14th. Okay, so they decided to revolt in the 13th year, but then in the 14th year, they're not paying. See, not only did let me give you a picture. We have the Fertile Crescent. Okay, Fertile Crescent. Over on the eastern side of the Fertile Crescent, a long way between them and Canaan. The crescent goes over, you stop at Iran, where Abraham was, and then you go down into Israel. In between is a big desert. But this Fertile Crescent is fertile. This Fertile Crescent is fertile. Oh, Barbara's MacBook. Good. I got you back. I got a little nervous because something happened there. So this, let's see, am I still going? 28:07. Oh, wait, good. I'm sorry. I just had to make sure we're still on. Okay. So think about the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent goes from Babylon, and it's fertile because there's lots of rivers. And these kings come over the Fertile Crescent, these kings from the east, and into the eastern part of Canaan. They come down, and because the people on the eastern side of Canaan are revolting, they're not paying their tribute. And tribute would be like taxes. They're just not paying it because they rebel. And so these kings who had conquered them 14 years before were now coming to get their tribute and a whole lot more. Because when they came the first time, they probably took slaves and booty and made them pay tribute every year. Now they're coming back to Canaan, the eastern side, because the Canaanites of Sodom, Gomorrah, Zoar, and two other places, they're not paying the tribute. So the people on the eastern side of the Fertile Crescent, remember that's over here, they come over the Fertile Crescent into the eastern side of Canaan, and they start, well, you'll see, they start battling against a whole lot of cities. So let's see what it says. In the 14th year came Chedorlaomer, or cheddar cheese, circle that word, and the kings who were with him. They struck the Raphaites in Ashtaroth, Karnaim, and Zuzites in Ham, the Emites in Sheveh, Kiryatayim, and the Horites in their hill country of Seir near El Paran, which is by the wilderness. As they returned, they came to En Mishpat, or Judgment Spring, that is now Kadesh, and struck all the territory of the Amalekites and all the Amorites who were settled in Hatzot-Zon Tamar. Now you're probably saying to me, okay, Barbara, really? Do we have to know all these cities? Well, the Israelites would have known those cities, and they would have realized that these kings from over the Fertile Crescent are capturing all these cities. They are a formidable force, and Sodom and Gomorrah and 3 other cities are going to come up against them? Yep, that's a little stupid, but we won't say that word. That's not nice. So they come down, they capture all these cities. Why is the author telling us all this? Well, they're telling us how extraordinarily formidable these kings from over the Fertile Crescent are. So that when Abram fights against them, and he has the Lord on his side, he's able to conquer over them. He's able to get everything back. And that's going to be amazing. And the author wants you to know how amazing our God is. He's so amazing that no matter what is going on, no matter what in our lives is going on, that God can defeat the enemy, whether he be human or the spiritual enemy of God's people. And we know that that's Satan. Okay, so what's going on here so far? We have these kings from over the Fertile Crescent coming over the Fertile Crescent to get their money. And the first thing they do is they go around and on the eastern side of Canaan, where Sodom and Gomorrah are. And the first thing they do is conquer over an awful lot of cities that were listed here that I could barely read, and you probably could barely read. And so that's the middle of our chiasm. And it's telling us how formidable those kings from the eastern side of the Fertile Crescent are. Then it goes D. And watch how D looks like the above D. Then went out the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. And they set their ranks against them in a war in the valley of Siddim against Chedorlaomer, cheddar cheese, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goyim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar. 4 kings against 5. Okay. Let's go over it again. The kings from over the Fertile Crescent come over the Fertile Crescent, go down the eastern side. Why are they coming? Because 14 years before they had conquered over 5 kings and were extorting tribute from them every year. But in the 12th year, um, uh, in, uh, in the 12th year, there was a kind of mutiny, wasn't there? And they decided that they didn't want to do this. Well, it was the 13th year because they had paid tribute for 12 years. 13th year, they decide not to do it. 14th year, the kings from who should have been getting their tribute from over the Fertile Crescent come to battle. They not only are going to go see Sodom and Gomorrah, but they're going to battle against a whole lot of other cities. They've had a year to drum up a big army, haven't they? And they have such a big army that they're able to defeat every city that they come upon. And then all of a sudden, they get to the valley of Siddim, and there are the forces of the 5 kings of Canaan, the eastern side of Canaan. And so we have a chiastic arrangement here to set up these kings, one set of kings against another. So watch how it reads. Let's go back to the top A. Amraphel, king of Shinar, Babylon. Arioch, king of Elasar. Chedorlaomer, king of Elam. And Tidal, king of Goyim. Now watch these words. Prepared for battle against. So they're going to prepare for battle against the other kings of Canaan. And who are the other kings of Canaan? Barak, king of Sodom, with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shenmebar, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. Okay, so then we have in the center a big battle that occurs before the battle of the kings from the Fertile Crescent and the kings of the eastern side of Canaan. Okay, so then we go again. This time, the last time, it was from the point of view of the kings of the Fertile Crescent. They came against the kings of Canaan. And now we're seeing it from the point of view of the kings of Canaan. It says, they went out. The king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. They set their ranks, what? Against. That word was used up here in verse 2. So, but in verse 2, it was kings from the Fertile Crescent that were going against the kings of Canaan. Now, it's the kings of the eastern part of Canaan who are also going against the kings from the Fertile Crescent. So we're seeing the story from 2 points of view. First, it's the kings of the east going against the kings of Canaan. Then we see the second point of view, and that's the kings of Canaan going against the kings of the from across the Fertile Crescent. So what the author wants us to see is that there's a clash going on, and he tells us from one point of view and then from another point of view, and we still don't know. At the end of the thing, we don't know who wins. We're not really told to the next chapter, but he gives us little hints. So watch the little hints. Number 1, he keeps naming the king who leads all this from the Fertile Crescent. Chedorlaomer, cheddar cheese. He's the leader. And who is he? He's the leader of the kings from over the Fertile Crescent. Now, he isn't named first, is he? He's in the B column, isn't he? But now we know that he's the head guy of the people from the Fertile Crescent. And down the bottom, the A and the B at the bottom, turns around. Did you see that? It's in reverse order, the two lines in reverse order, making cheddar cheese, king of Elam, first. So the author has done this so that at the end we see who was the leader of the group. It's told us in the middle, but now it's telling us again by reversing the order of the kings. Do you see that? Let's look at it. Now watch something else, another clue as to who's really the winner. If we looked at D above, we have Barak, king of Sodom, with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemabar, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. Watch the names down below. Then went out D, then went out the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, the king of Bela. What is missing? Their names are missing. Yes, they are. Now, why? Because they're not the important ones. They lost. So their names are not included in the second list. Tells us they are so unimportant, their names get missing. Now, this is going to be important because when Sodom, the king of Sodom, comes out to meet Abram, so does Melchizedek, king of Salem. The king of Sodom's name is still missing, but Melchizedek's name is still there, Melchizedek, king of Salem, contrasted with the king of Sodom, minus his name. So, our author has given us a lineup. He has the recount, the battle between the rebel kings of Canaan and the kings from over the Fertile Crescent. And in the chiasm, it's told at the top and the bottom. Whereas in the middle, we're given another battle, that is battles against other cities. Then it tells us at the very end, 4 kings against 5. How many kings from across the Fertile Crescent? 4. How many kings in Canaan? 5. Who should have won? The 5 kings, right? There's more, isn't there? And they're fighting for their own country, their own cities. But they lose, don't they? And that's going to play into what happens next. And so, did you notice that God is missing from this whole story? But we're going to see that God is very present. Now, if you feel like you got a little lost, repeat this. But I'm also going to go over it again next week. And I'll go over it just one more time now, if you need it. We've got kings who are from the eastern part of the Fertile Crescent. 14 years before, they won battles against the 5 cities in Canaan. And they're not paying tribute anymore. So these 4 kings, after a year of drumming up their soldiers, getting more and more soldiers, they come over the Fertile Crescent and they defeat many other cities. And they defeat these 5 kings who have rebelled against them. And what we're going to find out is that this becomes very important in the life of Abram. Even though Abram is never mentioned on this page, even though Yahweh is never mentioned on this page. This is a backdrop to what happens in the next page, which we will get into next week. Okay? You got it? If not, listen over again. Uh, uh, and really look at your paper. It's a chiasm and I want you to look at the A and the A and how they're the same, the B and the B and how they're the same, the D and C, D and D, and then that middle section. This is the way people would set up stories back then. Chiastically, not always. We saw it in the Deborah story one time. We saw it in the Rahab story, and other stories have it chiastically arranged. But in this story, we have again a chiasm. Why? Well, it sets up that middle section as important. It's important to show how formidable the kings from the eastern side of the Fertile Crescent are. It's also important to be set up chiastically because it makes it easier to read, doesn't it? And to memorize, because people would memorize these narrative epics because it became so exciting, and it would be handed down through the generations. Okay, you've got it? Well, God bless you, and I'll see you next week. And if you feel a little lost, it's okay. It's okay. We're going to be going over this for several weeks. Okay? See you next week. Bye-bye.